I was finishing filling out a patient's chart when I heard screams and the sound of many feet pounding in the hallway. Peeking out of the office, I froze in place. Standing in the middle of the hospital lobby was a huge adult tiger. But what I saw next left me completely speechless. Once the initial shock wore off and I could get a better look at the animal, I realized it wasn't an ordinary tiger, but an all-white one, and in its jaws this incredible predator was carefully holding a tiny white tiger cub. People scattered in panic, some screaming, others trying to barricade themselves in offices, and an elderly woman in the emergency room fainted right at the reception desk. The tiger stood motionless, its amber eyes watching the proceedings, but I didn't see any aggression in its stance. A few minutes later, police officers burst into the lobby with their guns drawn, and the situation could have ended tragically. One of the officers was already aiming at the animal, ready to shoot. I jumped forward and waved my arms, yelling at them not to shoot, because a few years ago I'd worked as a volunteer at a game reserve in Africa and had extensive experience with lions, leopards, and other large predators. The police officers hesitated for a second, and I quickly explained that if the tiger had come here aggressively, it would have already attacked, but instead, it was simply standing there with its cub in its mouth, as if waiting for something to happen. The senior officer looked at me suspiciously, but still ordered his subordinates to lower their weapons and give me a chance, although he warned that they would shoot at the slightest sign of danger. I slowly, very slowly, began to approach the tiger, trying not to make any sudden movements and keeping my hands visible. My heart was pounding because even with experience working with predators, you understand that in front of you is an animal that can break a person's neck with one blow of its paw. When we were about 3 meters apart, the tiger suddenly carefully lowered its head and placed the cub on the floor, then took a few steps back, never taking its expectant gaze from me. There was so much trust and despair in this gesture that it took my breath away. I realized it wasn't a tiger, but a tigress, and she hadn't come to threaten people, but to ask for help for her cub. What happened next changed everything. I crouched down next to the cub and immediately saw that the baby was in critical condition. The cub was barely a week or two old, lethargic, barely moving, its small eyes half closed, and its breathing ragged and labored. I carefully picked the cub up. It was very hot from the high temperature and severely dehydrated, the skin on its withers not straightening out, indicating a lack of fluid in its body. The tigress tensed when I picked up her cub, but she didn't move, only emitting a low, guttural rumble that sounded more like a plea than a threat. I quickly called my colleagues, and a minute later, 2 more doctors and a nurse rushed out, though they were careful to keep a respectful distance from the tigress. We carried the cub into the treatment room, and the tigress slowly followed us, ignoring the police officers, who were nervously clutching their guns. When we began examining the cub, the picture turned out to be even worse than I thought. In addition to severe dehydration and a high fever, the cub showed signs of infection, possibly from the dirt and unsanitary conditions, and was so emaciated that every rib was visible beneath its white fur. The tigress settled by the treatment room door and refused to leave, emitting an anxious rumble every time the cub made a weak squeak. I knew she was on edge. Her maternal instincts were driving her to stay close to her cub, but she was holding back and not attacking us. Between treatments, I approached the tigress, speaking quietly to her in the soothing tone I'd used with wounded lionesses in Africa, and she seemed to understand we were trying to help. We gave the cub N4 to rehydrate her, an antipyretic, and a broad-spectrum antibiotic, as the infection could have been anything, and we couldn't wait for test results. While we were fighting for the cub's life, one of the police officers, an experienced detective, began gathering information about where a white tiger could have come from in the city. He interviewed witnesses who had seen the tigress running through the streets early in the morning, checked CCTV footage, and retraced her route. A couple of hours later, the detective returned with information. The cameras had recorded that the tigress had emerged from an industrial area on the outskirts. The location of an old warehouse with a high fence and barbed wire, long considered abandoned by locals, was unknown. The detective contacted Wildlife Control and they decided to conduct a drone reconnaissance before breaking in. As if it were indeed an illegal breeding facility, the criminals might try to destroy evidence, meaning they might kill the animals. As the drone soared over the area, the operators saw a chilling sight. Rows of metal cages stood in the yard under the scorching sun, containing dozens of wild animals, many of them extremely rare species. It became clear this was a large-scale operation involved in the illegal trade of exotic animals, and immediate action was needed. Special forces organized a lightning raid to prevent the criminals from taking any action, and I was asked to accompany them as a wildlife specialist to assess the animals' condition and assist with their transportation. When we burst into the compound, several men tried to grab weapons, but the special forces acted so quickly and professionally that they were apprehended within seconds. One of the kennel owners managed to grab a pistol and run toward the cages, obviously intending to shoot the animals to hide the evidence. But a sniper neutralized the threat before he could fire. What I saw in those cages made my fists clench in rage. In cramped, dirty metal boxes, standing in the open sun, incredible creatures languished. A white lion with dull fur lay in the corner of its cage, barely raising its head, while a black panther, its ribs protruding, thrashed nearby, its emerald eyes blazing with hunger and anger. In another cage sat a snow leopard, clutching a tiny cub that was whining pitifully. Nearby, in a very small cage, sat a baby orangutan, its almost human eyes gazing with such longing that I wanted to rip the door off. In a separate cage, I found a red panda, which usually lives in cool mountain forests, but here it was suffocating in the heat, its tongue lolling out and panting rapidly. All the animals were emaciated and dehydrated to varying degrees, some with wounds and abrasions from the cramped cages. I quickly assessed which animals needed urgent care and coordinated the efforts of the veterinarians who arrived, bringing transport cages, water, and medicine. While we were busy with the animals, the police interrogated the detainees, and one of them, a junior accomplice who clearly didn't want to get the same sentence as the leaders, began to tell everything. It turned out that the white tigress had been brought here pregnant just a couple of weeks earlier. She'd given birth right there in a filthy, stuffy cage a few days earlier, and the owners immediately realized they had an incredible rarity on their hands. White tigers are already extremely rare, about 1 in 10,000 normal ones, and the cub was also white, making the pair priceless for wealthy collectors. The problem was that the tigress herself was emaciated and hungry, her milk supply was low, and the cub began to weaken almost immediately after birth. The criminals tried to feed the cub some cheap antibiotics bought over the counter, hoping to somehow hold it together until they found a buyer willing to pay hundreds of thousands for such a rarity. But the improper treatment only worsened the situation. The cub developed an infection and grew increasingly weak, and the tigress, apparently driven by maternal instinct, sensed that her cub was dying. The accomplice reported that the previous night they discovered that the tigress had somehow managed to break the lock on the cage, grabbed the cub, and escaped through a hole in the fence they had previously made for garbage disposal. She had traveled several kilometers through the city, instinctively moving toward crowds of people. Despair overcame her natural fear of humans. Reaching the hospital was pure luck, but that luck saved her cub's life. The rescue operation at the nursery took several hours. Each animal had to be examined, stabilized, and placed in a transport cage. The white lion had to be literally carried out on a stretcher, so weak was he. The black panther hissed and snapped until a veterinarian sedated him. The snow leopard refused to let anyone approach her cub until I showed him that I had food and water in my hands. The baby orangutan grabbed me with its tiny hands and refused to let go, as if afraid of being put back in a cage. All the animals were distributed to specialized rehabilitation centers and sanctuaries around the world. The white lion was sent to a large reserve in South Africa, where several individuals of its species already lived. The black panther went to a rehabilitation center for big cats, where it faced a long recovery. The snow leopard and its cub were transferred to a high-altitude reserve, where they were provided with conditions as close to natural as possible. The baby orangutan flew to a primate rehabilitation center, where it will be taught the skills necessary for life in the wild, and the red panda went to a zoo with a conservation program for rare species. As for the perpetrators, they were arrested and charged with illegal wildlife trafficking, cruelty to animals, and endangering public safety. It turned out that this group worked for an international smuggling network that supplied rare animals to wealthy clients around the world, from Arab sheiks to Asian businessmen. The breeding center had only been in operation for a few months, but during that time, dozens of animals had passed through it, most of which had already been sold and exported abroad. The white tigress and cub were sent to one of the best big cat sanctuaries, where they were given a huge enclosure with a natural landscape, a pond, and numerous hiding places. The cub was still weak for the first few days, but under the care of experienced veterinarians and thanks to the mother, who was now receiving a normal diet, he began to recover rapidly. Within a week, his temperature had returned to normal, the infection had subsided, and the cub began to gain weight. 3 months passed before I was able to escape and visit the tigress and cub at the sanctuary. When I arrived, the staff led me to their enclosure, and what I saw filled my heart with incredible joy. A tigress lay in the shade of a large tree, and next to her, a noticeably larger and stronger cub frolicked, its white fur glistening in the sun, its eyes sparkling with curiosity and energy. As I approached, the tigress raised her head and looked at me, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of recognition in her amber eyes. The cub jumped around its mother, trying to catch her tail, and she patiently allowed it to play, occasionally gently nudging it with her nose when it got too carried away. Reserve staff reported that the tigress was a surprisingly calm and caring mother, teaching her cub everything it needed to know, and it had every chance of growing up healthy and strong. In a few years, when the cub became an adult, they planned to include it in the white tiger breeding program to preserve this extremely rare genetic variant. Standing by the enclosure fence and observing this peaceful scene, I thought of how the tigress had traveled several kilometers through an unfamiliar city full of dangers, risking her own life just to find help for her dying cub. A mother's love proved stronger than her instinct for self-preservation, stronger than her fear of humans, stronger than all the obstacles that stood in her way. Thanks to this boundless maternal love, the white tiger cub was given a second chance. He would grow up in the wild, safe, next to the mother who had risked everything for his survival. If you enjoyed this incredible story here on StorySphere, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next amazing tale. Thank you for watching StorySphere.